They say the most dangerous poison is the one you do not know you have consumed. A sweet wine, a lover's kiss, a father's ambition. For Lucretia Borgia, they were all one and the same. History remembers her as a monster, a pawn, a whore wrapped in silk and piety. They whisper of incest, of a ring that dripped poison, of a smile that could mask a death sentence. But before the venom, there was the girl. Before the accusations that would echo through 5 centuries, there was a child with eyes the color of a summer sky, born into a world where even the shadows had secrets. To understand the monster, you must first understand the girl. You must walk back through the blood and the rumors. Back to a quiet room where the only sound was the tolling of a midnight bell, because the deadliest traps are never forged in fire. They are woven slowly, thread by silken thread, in the stillness of a cradle. The night air over the hills of Subiaco was cool and clean, carrying the scent of wild rosemary and the damp earth of early spring. It was a simple, holy place, where the prayers of monks were as constant as the flow of the river Anya. But in the year 1480, in a modest stone house owned by a man of God, a very unholy miracle was taking place. Inside, lit by the flickering dance of tallow candles, a woman's cries were muffled by the thick walls. Her name was Venetia Deca, a courtesan of breathtaking beauty and quiet intelligence, whose greatest gift and greatest curse was the love of a man who could never truly be hers. For the father of the child struggling to enter the world was Rodrigo Borgia, a Spanish cardinal, whose ambition was a beast that fed on power and prayer in equal measure. He was a man who served God with one hand while grasping for the world with the other. Outside, a servant girl clutched a rosary, her lips moving in a frantic, silent prayer, as if she could bargain with the Virgin for the soul of the child born of such a union. Just as the great bell of the Benedictine Abbey tolled its first note of midnight, a new cry joined it. Not a wail of terror, but a clear, sharp sound that cut through the heavy air. The midwives, their hands slick with the work of birth, would later cross themselves and swear it was an omen, though they could not say for good or for ill, an omen for the child or for the world that would have to make room for her. The infant was wrapped in clean linen and held aloft in the unsteady light. She did not blink or screw up her face as newborns do. Instead, her eyes, wide and unnervingly calm, seemed to fix upon the flame. As if recognizing a familiar soul, they named her Lucretia. No choirs sang. No papal pronouncements were made. It was just a name, a secret whispered in the chamber of a cardinal's mistress. A promise made by a man who collected children as other men collected art. The town of Subiaco slept on, unaware that a life had begun that would one day be entwined with the fate of thrones, the ruin of dynasties, and the darkest sins whispered in the confessionals of Rome. History loves a grand entrance, a birth announced by thunder and cannon fire. But the most dangerous lives often begin this way, in the dead of night, with the tolling of a distant bell and the quiet, terrible innocence of a newborn's gaze. In those first years, Lucretia's world was a small, slow circle of stone floors and olive groves. The rhythms of Subiaco were ancient and unchanging. Women gossiped at the fountain, their voices a soft murmur against the splash of water. Monks drifted through the town like gray ghosts on their way to vespers. It was a peaceful world, a gentle world, but it was a lie. Because a few days' journey away, Rome was awakening. The Renaissance was not just an idea. It was a fever. It burned through the city, melting down the old world and forging something new, beautiful, and utterly ruthless. New basilicas clawed at the sky, their domes audacious against the heavens. Painters were discovering colors that seemed stolen from paradise itself, while sculptors wrestled angels from cold, unyielding marble. In the courtyards of the great palazzo, scholars argued over lines of Plato, their voices sharp with the thrill of rediscovering a forgotten age. It was a time of breathtaking beauty and breathtaking ambition. and the two often shared the same bed. Rodrigo Borgia was a man of his time. He visited Subiaco when his duties in the Vatican allowed, a whirlwind of scarlet robes and expensive perfume. When he entered the house, the servants would melt into the walls, their heads bowed. He was not a father who offered easy affection. He would stand over Lucretia's cradle, his dark eyes assessing her as a merchant might assess a flawless pearl. He saw the pale gold of her hair, the perfect curve of her mouth, and he saw a future. He saw an asset. He would trail a finger along her cheek, his touch both a caress and a calculation. It is a strange and brutal education. To be loved and to be appraised in the same glance. Lucretia would master this silent language of power before she could even form the words for it. In the evenings, Vanessa, her mother, would rock her. The cradle would creak, a steady, soothing rhythm against the whisper of the wind in the olive trees. We do not know what songs she sang. Perhaps they were simple lullabies, melodies passed down through generations of mothers. Or perhaps they were invented for Lucretia alone. Wordless tunes meant to build a small wall of peace around a child whose life would know so little of it. The local priests, of course, knew the arrangement. They would see the cardinal's carriage and raise their brows. But they said nothing. In the Rome of the 15th century, the hypocrisy of the church was as thick and cloying as the incense in its cathedrals. Celibacy was a vow. Mistresses were a reality. Cardinals and bishops kept women in lavish homes, and their illegitimate children, known as nephews and nieces, were often given positions of power. Rodrigo was no different. Yet there was something in the way he regarded this daughter that set her apart. She was not merely a comfort or a sin. She was an instrument, waiting to be tuned. She grew with a startling quickness. Her first steps were not the stumbling, uncertain efforts of most children. They were deliberate, her small feet placed firmly on the cool stone floor. Her laughter was not a simple, childish giggle. It was a quiet, musical sound that made servants pause and turn, wondering what secret amusement she had found in the play of light on a wall. There are children like this, born with an old soul, who seem to be observing the world from a place of deep, ancient knowledge. Some call it grace. In the house of Borgia, it would soon be honed into a weapon. The cradle was put away, its gentle rocking replaced by the scratch of a quill on parchment. Before she could properly read, Rodrigo had arranged for tutors. The new wave of humanism sweeping through Italy preached that a mind, even a female mind, was a garden to be cultivated. But for a Borgia, it was an armory to be stocked. Lucretia was not to be merely educated. She was to be shaped, polished, and made ready. When Rodrigo eventually departed Subiaco for the last time, summoning his family to the heart of the beast in Rome, he left behind not just a child, but a fully realized plan. And a plan, once set in motion by a man like Rodrigo Borgia, has the weight and inevitability of fate. It wraps itself around a life, tightening its grip with each passing year. The bells of the abbey still rang out each night, their sound rolling across the valley. The people of Subiaco heard only the call to prayer, the marking of another day's end. But if you had stood beneath Lucretia's window, you might have heard something else in their tolling. Not an end, but a beginning, a summons, a warning that a far greater, far more terrible world was waiting for her. Just beyond the sleeping hills. The scent of the room where she slept, the texture of a wooden doll in her hand, the specific slant of morning light across her face, these details are lost to us, but they were real. They were the small, soft things that built her before the world tried to break her, and perhaps, in the dark years that were to come, when she was surrounded by enemies who wore the faces of friends, she would remember that quiet room, and the gentle creak of a cradle that held all the storms of her life in its simple, rhythmic sway. The soft, rhythmic creak of the cradle faded, replaced by a new sound, just as quiet but infinitely sharper. The whisper of a fine-tuned quill moving across expensive parchment. The girl sat at a small, carved desk near a window that opened onto a Roman courtyard. The morning light, thick with the city's golden dust, streamed in, illuminating the tiny particles dancing in the air. The room smelled of beeswax, dried herbs, and the faint, metallic temps of ink. Beyond the window, the bells of a nearby church murmured their call to but she was no longer a child who needed their rhythm to sleep. She was learning now, not just to read and write, but to build a fortress inside her own mind. Lucretia was perhaps 8 years old, though there was a stillness in her that belonged to someone much older. Her hair, the color of spun gold, was tied back with a simple ribbon, but a few strands escaped, framing a face of unnerving composure. Her eyes, a clear, intelligent blue, moved across the Latin text, not with the struggle of a student, but with the quiet confidence of a diplomat reading a treaty. This was not the education of a typical nobleman's daughter, who might learn enough letters to read a prayer book or manage household accounts. This was the education of a prince. Rodrigo had not chosen simple priests as her tutors. He had hired the best humanist scholars he could find, men and women who understood that language was power. Her principal governess, Adriana de Milla, a cousin of Rodrigo's, was a formidable woman steeped in the new learning. She spoke with a crisp, clear diction, believing that a well-formed sentence was as strong as a castle wall. Under her tutelage, Lucretia mastered Italian, then the Catalan Spanish of her father's heritage. French followed, with its courtly deceptions, and then Latin and Greek, the languages of emperors and philosophers. Words were no longer just words. They became keys. She learned that the right phrase, spoken in the right tone, could unlock a secret, soothe an enemy, or hide a lie in plain sight. Some children learn to fight with their fists. Lucretia learned to fight with rhetoric. Some learned to flee from danger. She learned to greet it with a perfectly composed smile and a quote from Ovid. Outside her tranquil study, Rome was a chaotic symphony. Cartwheels groaned on the cobblestones. Merchants hawked their wares in a dozen different dialects. In the distance, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer kept a relentless beat. But inside these walls, time was measured in the turning of pages and the drying of ink. The stories her tutors told her were not children's fables. She learned of Cleopatra, who held an empire in her thrall through wit and will. She learned of Livia, the wife of Augustus, who moved through the corridors of power like a silent, deadly serpent. These were not just history lessons. They were instruction manuals. They taught her that power had many faces, and that the quietest were often the most lethal. They also taught her a strange, chilling form of detachment, to see the world and its violent passions as a grand, repeating story in which she was now a character. She was learning to watch the play from the wings, even as she was being pushed toward the center of the stage. Rodrigo's visits were more frequent now. His climb toward the ultimate prize, the papal throne, was accelerating. When he entered a room, the very air seemed to grow heavy, charged with his ambition. He was not a man for idle praise. He would inspect Lucretia's translations, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He would quiz her on matters of history and philosophy, a faint, approving smile touching his lips when her answers were quick and clever. One afternoon, he picked up a lock of her golden hair, letting it run through his fingers as if it were currency. "Cleverness, little one," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "In this world, beauty is a key, but cleverness is the hand that turns it. Strength can be broken, but a sharp mind can find a crack in any wall." She was still a child, and the full, brutal meaning of his words was beyond her grasp. But she understood the feeling behind them. She understood the cold, hard weight of his expectations. She understood that his affection was a form of investment, and he would one day expect a return. She was a Borgia, and for the Borgia, love was always intertwined with purpose. Her first forays into the city of Rome were like stepping from a quiet chapel into a ravenous carnival. Holding Adriana's hand, her small shoes sinking into the dust of streets that had felt the tread of Caesars. She was overwhelmed by the sheer, unapologetic life of it all. She saw the ruins of the Forum, vast, broken skeletons of a dead empire, their marble bones picked clean by time. She smelled the exotic spices in the market, the sweet rot of fruit, the sweat of horses, and the ever-present smoke of thousands of oil lamps. She saw the faces of the people, pilgrims with hope-scrubbed eyes, merchants with avarice in their glance, cardinals whose serene expressions hid souls knotted with intrigue, and she began to notice how they looked at her. Once they knew her name, their eyes would change. It was a flicker of fear, of curiosity, of deference. They were not looking at a child. They were looking at a name, a symbol of a rising power that was beginning to cast a very long shadow. Borgia. She learned to wear the name like a cloak, sometimes pulling it close for protection, other times letting it hang loosely, so as not to draw unwanted attention. These were the lessons that took place outside the library. She learned to lower her eyes demurely while absorbing every detail of a room. She learned that a smile could be a shield, and that true power lay not in what was said, but in what was understood in the silence between words. At night, in the Grand Borgia Palazzo near the Vatican, she would sit by her window. Rome did not sleep. It sighed, it murmured, it whispered to itself. A lute would play in a distant courtyard, a melancholy song of unrequited love. The watchmen would call out the hour, their voices echoing in the narrow streets. The city was a living thing, and its breath was made of secrets. She could not know, then, that her own name would become one of its most enduring and infamous whispers. She could not know that the beauty she saw from her window, the moonlight on the Tiber, the silhouette of a cypress tree against the sky would one day be the backdrop for her family's greatest triumphs and most monstrous crimes. But a sense of it was beginning to form within her. Children raised in the epicenters of power develop a sixth sense. They can feel the subtle shifts in atmosphere, the unseen currents that move beneath the placid surface of courtly life. As she listened to the city's nocturnal heartbeat, she began to understand, in a way that was more feeling than thought, that her quiet, scholarly childhood was an overture. The opera itself, bloody and magnificent, was about to begin. Adriana would often sit with her before she slept, brushing the tangles from her long hair with a silver-backed brush. The governess would continue her lessons in these quiet moments, telling her of Virgil's Dido and Ovid's wronged heroines, women of great passion and greater sorrow. The world will try to write your story for you, Lucretia, she would say, her voice soft but firm. It will cast you as the saint or the sinner. Your task is to be the author of your own soul, even if you cannot control the tale they tell. It was wise counsel, but even Adriana knew it was a near impossible task. The daughters of men like Rodrigo Borgia were not authors. They were pages, beautifully illuminated, on which their fathers wrote treaties of ambition in the ink of marriage contracts. The memory of the cradle was gone, replaced by the hard reality of the world. But its rhythm, the steady, rocking inevitability of a fate set in motion long ago, was a pulse she could feel deep in her bones. The quill lay on the desk, its work for the day done. The ink was drying. Tomorrow would bring more lessons, more words, more practice in the art of being Lucretia Borgia. But for now, there was only the breathing of the city and the quiet, waiting presence of a destiny she was just beginning to comprehend. The quiet scratch of the quill faded, lost in the echoing footsteps that now filled the halls of the Palazzo Borgia. The air here was different from anywhere else in Rome. It was heavier, scented with power, polished wood, expensive incense, and the faint, almost imperceptible smell of fear. The stillness in these corridors was a lie. It was the coiled silence of a predator waiting to strike. Lucretia, now on the cusp of womanhood, moved through these halls with a grace that was both natural and meticulously crafted. Her face still held the softness of youth, but her eyes were ancient. She had mastered the art of being present, but unnoticed. Her calm, a small, still lake in the center of a hurricane. And the hurricane was her family. If Rodrigo Borgia was the calculating mind of this new dynasty, her older brother, Cesare, was its furious, magnificent heart. 5 years her senior, Cesare was a tempest in human form. He was brilliant, restless, and possessed of a charisma so intense it was almost violent. Where Lucretia was the moon, cool and reflective, Cesare was the sun, a blazing source of heat and light that scorched everything it touched. He moved not like a cardinal's son, but like a wolf, every line of his body radiating a supreme, predatory confidence. The bond between them was immediate, profound, and to the outside world, deeply unsettling. They had grown up in the same gilded cage, breathing the same perfumed poison. They shared a language that had no need for words, a telepathic understanding of a glance, a gesture, a subtle shift in posture. When they were young, they would steal away to forgotten corners of the palazzo, their heads close together, whispering secrets they believed no one else could understand. To the gossips of Rome, this fierce, exclusive loyalty was unnatural. It was too intense. And in a city that thrived on slander, their closeness would soon become the seed of the darkest rumor of all, a story that, once told, could never be unsaid. Then there was Juan, the second son. As handsome as Cesare, but lacking his brother's fire and intellect, Juan was polished armor with nothing inside. He was Rodrigo's favorite, a fact that baffled everyone but revealed a simple truth. Rodrigo valued loyalty and obedience. And Juan, unlike the volatile chief, was easy to command. The father's open preference for Juan laid the first stones of a murderous resentment in Caesar's heart. Lucretia saw it. She watched the way Caesar's jaw would tighten when their father praised Juan, the flicker of contempt in his eyes. She stood between them, a silent bridge over a widening chasm of jealousy. In this family, love was a weapon, and affection was a currency to be distributed for strategic advantage. The Borgia home was a stage, and every day was a performance. There were lavish banquets where laughter echoed off frescoed ceilings, but beneath the table, alliances were being brokered and enemies silently marked. There were concerts where the music of lutes filled the air, but the sweetest melodies could not drown out the hum of conspiracy. Lucretia learned to play her part flawlessly. She learned to greet her father's powerful guests with a perfect, modest curtsy while her mind catalogued their weaknesses. She learned to engage a French ambassador in a witty discussion of all the while assessing his true intentions. Adriana de Milla, ever watchful, had taught her well. Her greatest lessons were not in grammar, but in observation. How to read the subtle language of a room. How to notice the man who sweats when a certain name is mentioned. How to understand the meaning of a smile that does not reach the eyes. These were the arts of survival. Sometimes, late at night, the performance would end. The great house would fall into a semblance of sleep. It was then that Lucretia, unable to quiet her mind, would creep from her bed. She would press her ear to the thick, unforgiving wood of her father's study door. She could hear the low murmur of voices from within, the clink of a wine goblet against the table. Rodrigo and his most trusted advisors, men who held the fate of Italy in their hands, were plotting. She would hear fragments, whispers that were the building blocks of her future. Milan, Naples, Sforza, Orsini. The names of the great families and cities were spoken, like pieces on a chessboard. She did not yet understand the full complexity of the game, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that she was one of those pieces. One night, as she knelt there, her ear pressed to the keyhole, a hand fell upon her shoulder. She did not flinch. She knew the touch. It was Cesare. He didn't scold her or send her away. Instead, he knelt beside her, a conspiratorial smile playing on his lips. He pressed his own ear to the door, and for a long moment, they listened together. Brother and sister. two young shadows eavesdropping on the creation of their own destiny. In that silent, shared act of espionage, their bond was sealed. It was not the incestuous union their enemies would later imagine. Not yet. It was something perhaps more dangerous, a pact of survival. They were the children of the wolf, and they knew that in the world their father was building, they could trust no one but each other. Outside, the Roman night was alive. The clatter of a carriage, the distant shout of a drunken soldier, the relentless, indifferent flow of the Tiber. The river had seen empires rise and fall. It had washed away the blood of gladiators and the sins of popes. It was now waiting to receive the secrets of the House of Borgia. And Lucretia, kneeling in the dark with her brother's hand on her shoulder, was finally beginning to understand that the stories she had read in her books were pale imitations of the life she was destined to lead. The curtain was rising, and she was being pushed from the shadows into the unforgiving glare of the spotlight. If you wish to walk with me further into the light and shadow of this world, to witness the making of a legend and the damnation of a soul, then I invite you to subscribe, so that we may continue this journey together through the forgotten lives of the past.